Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Lawrence Joseph. He is a poet, essayist, critic, and a distinguished lawyer and professor of law at St. John's University in New York City. Joseph has published and lectured extensively in areas of labor, employment, tort and compensation law, jurisprudence, law and literature, and legal theory. He is also an internationally acclaimed poet. His fourth book of poems, Into It, published in 2005, received widespread attention and praise. Published simultaneously with that book, another volume entitled Codes, Precepts, Biases and Taboos, Poems 1973 to 1993, is a collection of Joseph's first 3 books of poems. His prose book, Lawyerland, What Lawyers Talk About When They Talk About Law, was published in 1997 to international acclaim. Lawyerland is now being developed into a film by Mr. Mudd Productions. Joseph is the Oregon Humanities Center 2008-2009 Colin, Ruagh, Thomas O'Fallon Memorial Lecturer in Law and American Culture. His lecture, Being in the Language of Poetry, Being in the Language of Law, was delivered on April 16th at the Knight Law Center. The following day, he also gave a poetry reading on campus. Lawrence, welcome to UO Today.
Thank you, Barbara.
We're very pleased to have you here.
I'm very pleased to be here.
And we're going to keep you busy with a lecture tonight and then a poetry reading on Friday.
Comes with having both sides of my life.
Wearing 2 hats, yes. And in fact, that's where I'd like to start, if you wouldn't mind. You studied English literature first at the University of Michigan and then at Cambridge University. How did you make the shift to the law?
Well, when I was growing up, the only professional in my parents' generation, my grandparents emigrated from Lebanon and Syria in the early part of the 20th century, and my parents were born here, and they went. My father ran a market, a store in Detroit, and as his father did, and as my mother's father did, and the only professional in my parents' generation was an uncle who was a lawyer. And my brother's a lawyer, and we were raised to really be lawyers. And also I think now in retrospect I very much have the temperament to do it, or I wouldn't have done it as long as I have. I think I've just, for better or worse, have an imagination for the way the world operates, or at least try to figure out the way it operates. So when I was in Cambridge, I had to make the decision. I've been writing poetry, and I'd won awards in doing that, and I had probably intended to continue on and get a PhD in English. I wasn't interested in teaching writing or anything, and at that point there hadn't been that many masters in writing programs anyway. And so I would have been going on and getting a PhD in English, and it was a time when, as the time is now, and it really has been for on and off for a long period of time, it's an unpredictable kind of way to make a living, and I come from a lower middle class background where being able to make a living was fairly important. I also didn't want the writing of the poetry to be affected by how I was making my living, and so I went back and I started thinking about going, as my brother was in law school, and I thought about going to law school to not only a way to be more in terms of the way I would make my living. I could be more mobile in what I wanted to do, but also to really protect also the integrity of the writing, because I knew I was going to do it, and as I have for the rest of my life, it was very important for me to have the freedom to do whatever I wanted with it. And if I had another career, I felt that all I would really have to do is work twice as hard as everybody else, and if that's all I had to do, then that's what I would do. So that's, and so I returned from Cambridge and came back to Ann Arbor and Detroit, and went to law school in Michigan in 1973. I started in Michigan.
Is that the same law school that your brother had attended?
Yes.
I'm interested, given your cultural background, why there was a premium on becoming a lawyer as opposed to, say, a doctor or a policeman.
If there had been a doctor in the family, I think, and I had had any kind of scientific interest in that, I think that would have happened. I think I don't know how important my uncle being a lawyer was, but our skills were verbal, and I mean, I debated in high school. I did, student newspaper and student government and things like that. So it was a side where the people that knew me in high school would remember me very much as a very sort of social person in that way. And I continued in that. I mean, law is has a political side to it, very important political side to it. It's involved very intricately in politics. And so I could make that move in that way. Also, it's as I stated in my talk, it's law is language, if it's anything, and it's other things other than that, but it's at least a system of language. And I think there was an attraction to that. And as it's played out, the two sides of my life have played out, it's clearly there's overlap between the two. And so something in me was moving into this at a number of levels.
You've done a lot of work, you've published on the subjective quality of legal language and how we sometimes presume, perhaps too easily, that legal language is transparent and objective. But you're very eloquent on the topic of it being subjective and dependent on how we understand it in other contexts. Does this make you a bit of a pioneer in that field?
No, it's there. Well, there was a movement in legal theory, or even which would overlap into jurisprudence, that surfaced in the 1970s, right about the time I started law school, which I was aware of somewhat because of some of what was going on in Michigan. And then later in the 1970s into the early 80s, it surfaced quite strongly. And it comes out of an earlier side of jurisprudence, which is legal realism, which broke down the formalized thinking about law, that kind of sense that people have it before they begin to immerse themselves in understanding the way the legal system operates and the way legal language operates, as language being something transparent or objective. But by the 1980s, there had been a great deal of writing on this. The perspective I could bring to it was the perspective of language from being a poet and what had happened in the development in the history of aesthetics, really, modernism in poetry, which I know a great deal about, and the way in which the language operated subjectively and objectively, and the way the poem began to be looked at as an object in terms of the history of the development of poetry into the 20th century. And I brought some of that thinking to bear on the way the legal language operates, in terms of being the premise being that poetry is the most concentrated form of language, and that what happens in poetry and language is going to be happening in any language. And so that was the kind of approach that I took critically, and I started doing some things on that in terms of in addition to other things I was doing.
I know that your premise then is that both legal language and poetry operate with the same medium, and therefore they must share some common properties. But you've also said that there are some critical dissimilarities in the language of the law and the language of poetry. Could you address those dissimilarities?
Yeah, the major one is that law is a language system that operates ultimately out of politics, in the sense that out of the political world, either from the sources of the law being in courts or being mostly in legislatures, and these come from political systems in some way or other. I mean, at least I'm speaking now in terms of the United States. So it's a very interesting language in that it has aesthetic qualities to it and formal qualities to it. At the same time, there are formal qualities that are ultimately premised in power and force. Poetry is, I think ultimately, I believe this is and I think in no small part because there's no way it really has no economic value in the society in terms of an object of any kind, where of course legal language is immersed in money, are immersed in the civil side and immersed in power and force of the state on the criminal side. You have none of that in poetry. Poetry is ultimately an autonomous kind of autonomous sort of aesthetic act. So it's an act of aesthetics. It's an act of form making. And the question of the power of the language or anything that's the source of the language coming from power doesn't come from the power. It comes from the imaginations of poets and what they're doing with language in their own particular language at a given time. And it's something very old, as is legal language, very, very old in the human species. But it's a very different kind of directives, really. The overlap is an interpretation, really, in the way in which language operates, and the way in which, and the subjectivity and objectivity is an important question in modernist poetry and postmodernist poetry, and it's also a very important question in law, because if in fact law is premised on power, then the subjectivity side of it becomes extremely vital in terms of the way the language operates, and this creates enormous kinds of problems and debates in jurisprudence in terms of interpretation. And you get it in Supreme Court opinions constantly, where the one side is calling the other side, they're not adhering to what the rules are or what the doctrine is, and they're injecting their subjective feeling. And the other side says the exact same thing, and it just goes back and forth, and has been for quite a while, and it just keeps moving on. The fact that it could be both, and that it also could be a system that's premised in power, is a little too much for most lawyers to be able to comprehend.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. One has to assume that it's at least a reasonably reliable medium in order to proceed at all.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that's exactly right. But at the same time, what happens is then it gets exposed as being something that's motivated by power groups or by people interpreting individuals, because we have the way our system's set up in terms of the Supreme Court. It's a relatively small number of people that are the third branch of our government, and it's a significant branch of the government, because they finally interpret the constitutionality of laws. That was part of the play in the politics of American political history, the court taking that role. And the tensions between the executive and the court were always very much in that, and we've been in the last several years very much in that.
You've said as well that that law is a world of money and power, as you mentioned, but also of violence. And all three of those bastions of Western society, money, violence, power, are so obvious in the dialogues between lawyers in your book, Lawyerland. It's fresh, it's a bit brutal, it's a bit surprising, a bit shocking. It's a wonderful read. I'm curious how it's going to become a movie. Do you know what the process is to turn that into a script and a narrative?
I haven't seen the script, and there apparently is a script, and I think the book is written formally. It's all lawyers talking to lawyers, and it has a documentary feel because there's an interviewer who is the eye of the book, which is the way I used to use the I in my poems. It's sort of me, but it's not me. It doesn't matter. It's a character, and there you have characters. And so the book has a kind of documentary feel. And because it's all lawyers talking to lawyers, I say at the beginning of the book that they're really composite characters, because no one would talk that openly on the record, and which is true. But I drew from interviews with a number of people and talking with a number of people, my own experiences, and created composite characters, some closer to real characters than real people than others. But it has a documentary feel. The movie, I think, is going to be, but it's really generically more. The genre of it's really a novel. It operates like a novel, and the way in all sorts of complicated ways. And some people read it that way, and others didn't. So I think the movie is going to track that. It's going to start as a documentary, and then it's going to move into a picture, a film, and it's going to move into something very different, and which is what the book does.
You talk about its documentary feel, but it is also very much rooted in some ways in the realm of narrative and fiction.
Very much so.
I read with great interest your note to the reader where you say this is a work of nonfiction, but then you quote Joseph Mitchell, it is truthful rather than factual, but solidly based on facts.
Yes.
So really one foot in each of those camps.
Yeah, and so it could have been, it's a book of, the term that surfaced after Lawyerland is a creative nonfiction, or there's this kind of problem of whether or not nonfiction, how much it's fictionalized, is surfaced in a kind of popular way. I was doing something very different, because the reason for doing that is that lawyers are not going to identify themselves if they're going to talk candidly about other lawyers, because they basically are watching the libel laws, and they're going to be very, very careful. So no one's going to go on the record and say what they really think. So that gave me the premise, really, as an artist, to allow myself to fictionalize this. And then I began to study the form of the really good writers on this. And Joseph Mitchell, who wrote for The New Yorker and did essays for The New Yorker, he would do that. And he would basically write these stories with people, and he would be making a lot of it up. They'd be based on real people, but he'd be using the techniques of a fiction writer. And then he had that note, which really interested me, because that is exactly what I was doing. So it appears to be, it has a nonfiction feel and a documentary feel, but it's necessarily fictionalized. And you say it right out front. So it has the feel of nonfiction, but it's fictionalized in its composition. And I think the genre would be a novel, because that, I think, is the kind of genre in prose that, when you don't have anything else that fits, it's a novel. Novels do it all the time. They have people with their Philip Roth has Philip Roth in some of his novels, for example. And it's interesting how the novelist will refer to the book sometimes. Sometimes they won't even put a novel. There's a French form that I think is closest to this book. Lawyerland is the récit, which is a form that Albert Camus uses in his récit, The Fall, or La Chute. And a récit is a recitation. And I have all these people essentially reciting. The book could work very well in theater also, because it's characters talking.
That's right. Dialogue is at the heart of it.
Yeah, dialogue and narration. And part of what I'm doing is it's all lawyers talking to lawyers, and no one had ever done this before. It's entirely a universe of legal language. And part of what I wanted to do was create that as a kind of something that nobody had done before. And very much aware of the way I was composing it, which poets are always aware of how they're composing things.
You have it culturally and geographically situated very specifically in Lower Manhattan. Is that emphasis going to be maintained in the film?
Yes, I would assume so. That's enormous now appeal with not only 9/11, but with the recent stock market, the recent economic crash.
Of course,
the
Wall Street.
quote-unquote Wall Street. But I wanted to do that well before. I mean, I wrote this book in the mid-'90s, I wanted to locate the landscape or the geography, and it's very plotted out where the characters are, where it's done, what times of year and everything. And part of that is that the great sort of prose piece written in downtown Manhattan is Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, and which he called a moral tale. And Lawyerland could be called a tale also. I mean, and I wanted to expand Melville also. I mean, Melville, who was also a poet, and but known more for his prose writing.
You mentioned moral tale as a kind of a subgenre. There's a deep, deep cynicism among the characters speaking in Lawyerland. Do you share that, or is it a discourse you've heard and are very familiar with from colleagues, but not necessarily one you feel yourself?
I'm not sure all the characters are cynical. There's some that are, and in fact one mentions that and says that it's only the hacks are cynics, and which of course would be something a cynic would say. No, I don't think cynicism's an interesting thing. I think something else is going on. I think some people can be cynical, and there certainly are lawyers that are cynical, but I don't think lawyers are any more cynical than anyone else. I think there's deeper kinds of pressures that operate in law. And a lot of this I found out just putting this together in the language, where it would go if I wanted to get as deep as I could into sort of composing this and trying to create a whole universe in this kind of language that had never been done before. There was a very, very high literary ambition to this, which some people have picked up on and most haven't. I mean, I'm very flattered by the read that somebody reads it and says, there was a New York Law Journal reviewed it and said, it's a great read and you'll all recognize, New York lawyers will recognize a lot of people they know in it. I mean, and they read it straight as nonfiction.
So it's also a roman à clé. People could read it as
that's
a thin
exactly.
disguise
There's
over
some
a
people
particular
who thought
set.
that they were being referred to. So.
One of the many things that distinguishes you with your bifurcated career is that you have succeeded so magnificently in both of them. I was really struck that both of your books of poetry released in 2005 were chosen as best books of the year by Joyce Carol Oates in the Times Literary Supplement. So obviously you've published the poetry to great acclaim. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. You've mentioned that both Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams have been influences for you. Is it partly because they too combined to a professional life and a successful life as a poet?
Yeah, I've always been intrigued by them. I've studied them very closely, they knew one another. They had a kind of competition and friendship with one another that I've located that I think has a lot to do with the development of the aesthetics of poetry in the 20th century. They also both, I think they both understood that the reason why they wrote poetry is because it was like a physical compulsion. They needed to do it. Which is what I've always felt. And they both state that separately from one another. And sort of, why do you do it? And why have you done both careers? And you do both careers because you have to do both careers. You're just made that way. There's nothing really special about this or anything. It's just that's what you do. And that side of it really comports to the way I feel. And that's why I'm attracted to both of them. They're very different imaginations. Stevens has a very strong interior side, which I have also, and Williams more of an exterior side, which I have also. And so I like to combine them both. And I like doctor writers, the writers that have also been doctors.
Medical doctor writers, you're saying? Yeah.
There's been a number of them, and they're always very interesting. Their sense of the physical world and the way they form the physical world.
Into it, there is again a very strong sense of place. It is, I think, in some ways a reflection of reaction to 9/11. You do seem to locate your writing in a very well-defined spatial culture.
Yeah, I think generally. There's some poems that don't. Where the location can be interior space. But my wife Nancy and I, we live a block from Ground Zero. And so this wasn't something abstract to us. So it just as my poems where the place is in Detroit or is in a specific place, this is really a specific place to us in the poems. So it isn't writing from a distance on this. And when I write from a distance on something, I usually put that in the poem. But this was right on the street, and so the experience is a very strong experience. And so my transposition of that, or my transposing of that into poetry, took a little while because I wanted to get it right, and because I knew that I could get it right if I really waited for the way to get it right, because there was an enormous amount of, needless to say, writing on this, and there still is. But what was really going on here in terms of the understanding of it is something that I felt that for whatever reasons I was given this, which I found that ironic wouldn't be the right word on it. And also coming from an Arab American background, that also added to what one might call the irony of it. But it isn't. This is an irony in an abstract or cerebral sense. This is irony right on the streets. I mean, and I like the streets, and I think I have a quote in, or one of the pieces in Lawyerland is all great problems come from the streets. It's from Nietzsche, actually.
I can imagine that you had a little resistance to accepting this irony that had been handed you and actually wading into this poetic language to describe the event or try to penetrate it in some way.
No, I knew I was going to. The minute I knew that Nancy was safe and we were safe, we were evacuated from our apartment, I began to know that I was going to write on it. I've written about violence. I'd written about war. I felt that, you know, there's two ways of looking at this. Like, well, you know, like, who needs this? And the other way of looking at it is, okay, if you're a poet and you're given this, this is what you got. And that actually, I think, is, you know, since we appear to be okay. And I mean, I think that was the side. I mean, immediately going to war after that then just sent me into a whole other level. And that was the violence, and which I've always written about. I've written about it from my first book in Detroit.
We're coming around to the end, but I've got a couple of last questions for you. I was struck by reading into it that the work is as much about language and the ability of language to talk about an incomprehensible event as it is about the event itself. So even the titles of the poems incline to speak, what do you mean, what, why not say what happens? Or were you deliberately also engaging with the power of language?
Yeah, no, always. I've always, Stevens says at one point that Stevens, I think it's Stevens that does, is either Stevens or Stein, but definitely Stevens, that one of the subject matter of poetry is poetry. And the subject matter of writing is writing, ultimately. How you express that and what you do with it formally isn't another question, but if you're creating something fictional, and poetry, as Stevens says, is the supreme fiction, you're constantly commenting on the very nature of what you're doing. At least I think that has to be part of poetry. Now, how you do it's another thing. And I think some poets overdo it, and I think that the poetry doesn't work as well. I think some poets don't do it at all, and I think therefore it doesn't work either. So this constant side, it's the major character in each of these books is somebody who is essentially a poet, somebody who's composing language.
I may need to stop you on that particular point, and I'll invite our viewers to go to the UO channel eventually to look at the film we'll make tonight from your lecture and your reading on Friday, and we'll let them discover that in your speaking.
Thank you so much, Barbara.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We've been speaking with author and lawyer Lawrence Joseph, who is professor of law at St. John's University and the 2008-2009 O'Fallon Lecturer in Law and American Culture. Thanks very much for watching.